Almost 10 years ago, at the conclusion of the 2016 conference of the European Society of International Law in Riga, on the theme How International Law Works in Times of Crisis, Jean-Marc Sauvé, who was then the Vice President of the French Conseil d'État, gave a public lecture on the closing day in which he affirmed, and I quote him, "Our era seems to mark a double rupture. Crisis is no longer punctual or periodic, it has become permanent. It no longer sheds light on the direction of progress. Instead, it generates indecision, disorder, and uncertainties regarding its causes and effects, its diagnosis and its remedies. Crises no longer fit naturally, as they once did, into the horizon of an after-crisis. This double rupture is undoubtedly linked to a profound upheaval in our conception of progress and in individual and collective identities. Today, we are confronted with the vertigo of an endless, orderless, and boundless crisis." End of quote. Although Jean-Marc Sauvé did not use the term permacrisis, his speech clearly referred to the very idea that the term encapsulates. The word permacrisis was chosen in 2022 by the English language dictionary Collins as its word of the year, a dictionary in which the word is defined as an extended period of instability and insecurity, especially one resulting from a series of catastrophic events. This definition, much like Jean-Marc Sauvé's speech in 2016, strongly suggests the idea of a crisis that is no longer exceptional or temporary, and which under these conditions no longer offers any foreseeable end or resolution. The term permacrisis has since gained considerable traction among political scientists, economists, historians, philosophers, and more recently among legal scholars, as evidenced by the Research Forum of the European Society of International Law, devoted to international law in the age of permacrisis. If we were to attempt to characterize the age of permacrisis, we could say in general terms that it manifests itself, or that it is described, in three ways. First, the age of permacrisis seems marked by a multiplicity of crises interwoven and feeding into one another to such an extent that they create a permanent state of crisis, preventing any prospect of a return to normalcy and impeding the establishment of conditions for a new stability. Second, the age of permacrisis seems to witness an erosion of institutions whose actions are deemed inadequate, leading to a growing distrust and, more broadly, on the international level, to skepticism towards multilateralism. Third, the age of permacrisis seems characterized by a level of uncertainty and instability of such intensity that they fundamentally limit the ability of decision makers, of commentators, observers, and scientists to conceive adequate responses, to anticipate and to plan action in order to meet the challenges prompted by such a situation. If we were to apply this concept to the field of international law, if we were to sketch an hypothesis deduced by the concept, from the concept, it might be the following. In the face of multiple and interconnected crises that would durably affect our societies, whether it be climate change, the threat to biodiversity, the successive pandemics, the acceleration and multiplication of migration movements, prolonged armed conflicts, or even territorial annexations, international law would find itself fundamentally impacted and its functions profoundly challenged. These intertwined crises could in turn generate crises within international law itself, testing its ability to address and regulate the global transformations of our world, perhaps even pushing it to exhaustion. Such a hypothesis, however plausible and serious, is difficult to verify without making significant choices regarding how to approach the issue. Such verification requires that an agreement is reached on at least 3 key points. First, does permacrisis exist? Depending on whether one adopts a positivist approach, which might assert that permacrisis exists in fact as an objective reality, or a constructivist approach, which might argue that permacrisis exists only insofar as it is socially constructed, particularly through language, but does not correspond to an objectively measurable phenomenon. Well, we might come to very different answers. Second, what constitutes a normal functioning of international law by opposition to an exceptional or crisis-driven mode of operation? Once again, you have different perspectives. A positivist approach to international law might define normal functioning as one which adheres globally to the prescription of formal sources of international law, whereas a more critical approach might argue that the normal functioning of international law is one that is continually shaped by contradictions between actors with opposing interests, with opposing legal interpretation, between actors with unequal power despite their formal equal existence. Third, what are the functions of international law within the societies it intends to govern? Is the role of international law to regulate, to pacify, to emancipate, to develop, to protect, or to control societies? These core functions can be understood in widely varying ways, an issue already raised during the 2006 European Society of International Law Conference in Paris, which posed the question, what is international law for? So for each of these 3 questions, multiple answers are possible, undoubtedly shaped by the theoretical schools of thought within which one positions oneself. And since no particular school of thought is more valid or more legitimate than another, from a scientific point of view, any evaluation of how permacrisis affects international law, its functionings and its ambitions remains highly relative. And I thus feel uneasy to suggest my own answer to this question, as it does not really bear any higher validity than any other answer. But in order to provide for some elucidation on this topic, I might rather engage in an attempt to compare what has been suggested about international law in time of severe crisis by the scholarship, and what is being said or could be said about international law in the age of permacrisis. More particularly, I would like to test the idea that permacrisis is a game changer for international law in the following sense. Could we say that what international lawyers have imagined in time of particularly severe crisis, the grid of understanding they have provided, or the reforms that they have suggested to overcome the crisis or to avert any forthcoming crisis of a similar nature. Could this still be possible in the age of permacrisis? In other words, I wonder whether the age of permacrisis is shrinking the horizon of our thoughts on international law. And I would like to address this issue in two parts. Firstly, I would like to recall that international lawyers have constantly engaged with the idea of crisis when confronted to specific events or particular transformations of societies. Crises have always been perceived as being there to last, as having the effect of destabilizing international law, of weakening international institutions, and fundamentally undermining multilateralism, thus sharing quite many of the characteristics of what has been labeled a permacrisis. That being said, I would like to highlight that however severe these crises were, or were described to be, international lawyers have quite consistently identified on these occasions weaknesses, failures, limits in international law in order to pave the ways for a renewed international law, more complete, more robust, more democratic. A renewed international law which would be capable to prevent the next crisis. In the second part of this speech, I would like to explore if this is still possible in the face of permacrisis. Maybe the difference lies not in the nature of the crises themselves, nor in their permanence or multiplicity, but rather lies in the intensity and speed at which crises now succeed and overlap, whether this acceleration is a reality, a perception, or a construction. Perhaps this difference, in turn, might influence the kind of responses or analysis that international legal scholars are able to formulate. It might be a little early to come to any definitive answers, as the term permacrisis is still recent and has not been extensively commented in international legal scholarship so far. But I will nevertheless suggest that it does not appear that the scope of our imagination or the strength of our belief in international law's ability to adapt, to evolve, to improve, is at present under jeopardy. This may come as a surprise, given the rather catastrophic current state of affairs encapsulated by the very concept of permacrisis. At the same time, this may be understandable for reasons that I will touch upon in my conclusion. Let me now turn to my first point on how international lawyers have addressed particularly dear crises in the past, crises that would prompt in their eyes a crisis of international law itself. I would like to give you some illustrations and excerpts of authors writing on this matter, but I had to make a choice, as there are dozens of articles and books devoted to that theme, making it simply impossible to even provide you with a glance on the richness of all these analyses. In order to illustrate the variety of views expressed on the crisis of international law and suggest a structure that might give a sense of this variety, I would say that these views are forged by the tension developed between four different postures that can be modeled in the following terms. The first one can be labeled a realist posture. It rather emerges from political science scholarship, and according to it, crises are just yet another sign of international law irrelevance, of international law's inability to constrain powerful actors. Crises are yet again revealing the limited, not to say inexistent, influence of international law in the wake of particularly brutal events. The second posture is a political state-centered posture, in the sense that you are then accepting that international law has a role to play and might exert some influence on the course of action, but in order to do so, international law should be based on sovereign's will, attentive to states' interests. Crises, in that perspective, are moments where necessities, whether security concerns or public orders preservations, should prevail. In such a posture, what might be envisaged in order to overcome a crisis is to adjust rules, making them less stringent upon states, providing for exceptionalism, preferring discreet diplomacy of variable content to formal multilateralism. The third posture is a rather idealist value-centered posture. You believe that international law matters, that it should guarantee peace, security, justice, and human dignity. Crisis appears as opportunities to taking stock of the limits of international law in order to address them and to better international law, to better its functioning. The tension, as much as the complementarity between a political posture and a more idealist posture, might remind you of the interaction between apology and utopia, described by Marty Koskienimi, or between a more liberal international law and a more welfarist international law, described by Emmanuel Thom-Joannet, as their works have been useful to shape these models that are also reminiscent to those to be found in a book entitled A Critical Introduction to International Law by Olivier Courtenne, François Dubuisson, Vaios Koutroulis, and myself. The fourth and last posture can be labeled a critical posture, where you believe that international law matters, but that international law is the result of contradictions between opposing interests of actors which have been allocated unequal power. International law, in that sense, results from, as much as it embodies, profound inequalities between states, between peoples, between individuals. Then you may then argue that crises are not what or where you think they are, and that if crises are to be overcome, it is only possible through radical changes within the structures of international law itself. This panorama only serves as a model to understand the dynamics between the different discourses which can be adopted on crises, on how they affect international law, and how international law may respond to them. I will now come to 4 specific authors commenting on the crisis of international law, and they do not relate to the respective 4 postures just mentioned, but rather their position is adopted and should be understood in the context of this ongoing conversation between these different postures, and might be therefore shaped by that conversation. Let me now turn to my first author. Well, wars have frequently, if not systematically, been identified by international legal scholars as major crises, crises that can persist over extended periods. The First World War, for instance, deeply unsettled international legal scholars of the time, many of whom perceived it as a fundamental challenge to the prevailing international legal order. A legal order which was quickly accused of having failed, both in preventing the war and in bringing it to the end once it had begun. Among the international legal scholars who understood the conflict as an opportunity to rethink international law was the Dutch jurist Jan de Lauter. In 1919, he published an article titled La crise du droit international, the crisis of international law, in the Revue Générale de Droit International Public. And he deliberately employed the term crisis in its medical sense, referring to a moment of acute pathology that signals a decisive change, either for the better or worse, in the progression of the disease. In reality, de Lauter had written this article in 1917, right in the middle of the First War, but its publication was delayed due to postal disruptions caused by the conflict. In this article, he wrote in French, and this is an unofficial translation, "In my view, international law is undergoing a phase of evolution that resembles a pathological crisis. It must be purified from top to bottom, reformed not only in its individual rules and institutions, but down to its very foundations. One must not hesitate to plunge the surgeon's scalpel deep into the living flesh of the patient. International law must undergo a rejuvenation cure that promises it a new and fruitful life." End of quote. So for de Lauter, international law needed profound reform to prevent future conflicts, and he proposed several measures to achieve this goal. The prohibition of territorial cessions obtained through coercion, except in the case where such transfer were genuinely desired by the concerned population. The promotion of international trade and the prohibition of protectionist measures. The safeguarding of the freedom of navigation on the high seas, both in peacetime and wartime. And the prohibition of secret treaties. By implementing these four concrete and specific measures, he believed international law could at least reduce the number of armed conflicts by eliminating the primary causes of wars, whether national, economic, commercial. De Lauter also responded to other critiques and proposals that argued that international law could only be relevant if it encroached further on national sovereignty. Well, he could not disagree more, stating that, and I quote here again an unofficial translation, "Progress does not consist in sacrificing national sovereignty in favor of a supranational sovereignty, but in assiduously developing the international legal community by using the sovereignty of independent states, each with a strongly distinct identity." End of quote. Thus, he advocated for deepening international cooperation and establishing institutions that would be capable of ensuring compliance with international law, including his proposed international jurisdiction court whose decision would be binding. More importantly, for international law to be truly renewed, war had to be regarded as an exception to the normal state of international relations, indeed as an outright antithesis of law itself. He wrote on this subject, and I quote again and translate freely, "When the sword is returned to its sheath, when exhausted and mutilated soldiers return to their extinguished homes and deserted gardens, their eyes will be opened. Countless voices will rise from the plains to demand accountability from government for their words and actions. Then will come the moment when it becomes clear that the world war, through its blood and tears, has sown the seeds of a new order, and that once again night and its terrors have given birth to a dawn, one that smiles upon the ruins and is full of promises for the future." De Lauter envisaged a legal system in which war would be fundamentally regulated and institutions would be sufficiently robust to enforce compliance. To him, the crisis of international law in 1917 was not just a catastrophe, but an opportunity for a profound renewal, one that left intact his belief in the potential of a legally regulated international society and the conviction that international law was on a path of progress. Let me turn now to my second author. The Second World War, marked by the Holocaust and the use of nuclear weapons, as well as the Cold War that followed, were also identified by numerous international legal scholars as catalysts or manifestation of a global crisis, one that affects all areas of human activity, including the field of international law. The Austrian legal scholar Joseph Kunz, who emigrated in the United States in 1932, made this theme the subject of a course at the Hague Academy of International Law, which was published in 1955. The course, titled La crise et les transformations du droit des gens, the crises and transformations of the law of nations, opened with the following remarks, again an unofficial translation from French to English. I quote him. "There is much discussion about the crisis of the law of nations among lay people, statesmen, and even within the academic discipline of international law. For some, it is a source of resignation, for others, a source of hope. It is therefore not surprising that there is currently great confusion regarding both the law of nations and the scholarly study of this law. Let us be frank. This crisis of the law of nations does indeed exist. However, one must immediately add that it is not an isolated crisis. The crisis of the law of nations is merely a facet of a total global crisis. Superficially, this global crisis, of which the crisis of the law of nations is an integral part, appears to be the result of the two world wars, particularly the second one. But in truth, the two world wars were not the cause of this crisis, but rather the manifestation of a pre-existing and far deeper crisis, the Western crisis." End of quote. According to Kunz, this crisis was fundamentally linked to the decline of Europe. He analyzed multiple causes for this decline, warning that it is to be feared that Europe's relative decline is not merely a temporary phenomenon caused by the suffering and the losses of the two world wars, but a permanent phenomenon. He observed the hegemonic position of the United States, which exerted military, diplomatic, economic, and financial dominance, a reality reflected in international law itself, notably with the establishment of the United Nations in New York and the reduced number of European judges on the bench of the International Court of Justice compared to the former Permanent Court of International Justice. At the same time, he noted the influence of the Soviet Union, whose ideology, though shaped by European thinkers such as Marx and Hegel, nevertheless imposed its power upon and divided Europe. This Soviet dominance, he argued, significantly affected international law, and in particular the functioning of its institutions, chiefly the United Nations Security Council. So Joseph Koons further observed that the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two dominant powers of the post-war world, was fundamentally shaping international law. This geopolitical competition, he argued, hindered the achievement of the United Nations core objectives, including collective security, disarmament, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. It marginalized the United Nations as the primary forum of major international discussions, as crucial negotiations often took place outside the United Nations framework, either publicly or in secret alliances. So this schism, he suggested, blurred the distinction between war and peace, preventing the development and codification of international law on a truly universal scale. Koons even questioned whether this division threatened the very existence and universality of international law. As he puts it, and I translate here freely his text, "The crisis we face today is global and total, an economic, financial, constitutional, political, and military crisis, a crisis that affects the daily lives of ordinary people. The same crisis is visible in the arts and even in the natural sciences. It is a pervasive feeling of insecurity and uncertainty. The ideals of yesterday are no longer valid, and the ideals of tomorrow are not yet within reach." The characteristics Koons attributed to this crisis align closely with what we now may describe as permacrisis. One of Koons' key insights was his argument that the state of international law is conditioned by our perception of it. He identified a pendulum effect in legal scholarship in which attitudes toward international law oscillate between two extremes: excessive optimism, as during the creation of the League of Nations, where many believe that international legal order based on law would guarantee peace, and skepticism, as seen after the founding of the United Nations, when the emphasis shifted from legal principles to power politics and security concerns, particularly during the Cold War. He further noted that interest in international law was waning in elite circles, particularly in the United States, where knowledge of international law was no longer a prerequisite for entry into the diplomatic service. He observed a decline of the teaching of international law in universities, replaced by courses on international relations. Even major philanthropic donations that had historically funded institutions, academies, and journals of international law had ceased after World War II, and there were similar signs in Europe in his eyes. However, despite this major crisis, Kuhn also observed signs of resilience. He noted the growing number of international administrative and technical unions, which indicated that states still had a fundamental desire to cooperate in addressing social and economic challenges. He saw hope in humanitarian efforts and technical collaboration, arguing that despite the crisis, there remained a fundamental sentiment of humanity, a kind of selfless love for others that offered in the midst of these very tragic events and crises a glimmer of hope. Kuhn identified two potential transformations that could signal the emergence of a new international legal order, though he remained very cautious in his prediction. Those two transformations were the development of the individual criminal responsibility for international crimes, and secondly, the recognition of individuals as subjects of international law. So despite the crisis, the deep crisis of international law he observed, Kuhn remained fundamentally optimistic. He warned against both naive idealism and extreme pessimism, advocated instead for a critical yet constructive approach, and he used the following words. He said that, and I translate here his words, "I remained optimistic regarding our ability to overcome this crisis and develop a stronger, more effective law of nations. For I refuse to believe, and I cannot believe, that in this atomic and thermonuclear age, humanity will consciously choose its own suicide." End of quote. Let me now turn to my third author, providing yet another perspective on the crisis of international law, such a crisis being not so much an objective legal phenomenon, but rather a discourse shaped by the dominant powers, a narrative constructed to discredit an evolving international order that they can no longer fully control. In 1982, French professor Francine de Michel published an article in Recherche Internationale titled "Le droit international est-il en crise? Is international law in crisis?" She argued that the prevailing doctrine among capitalist nations claimed that international law was in crisis. And she summarized this dominant Western perspective as follows. And here is my unofficial translation of her text. "More and more, it seems that nothing is certain anymore. The principles that were once firmly established are now being questioned, and situations that have long been accepted are no longer protected. Many examples illustrate this deterioration. No one knows anymore where territorial waters end or how far the right to free navigation extends. Similarly, the rights granted by all treaties to states and their nationals are now being contested, especially through nationalization. And traditional enforcement mechanisms such as diplomatic protection no longer work as they once did. The decline of international law's authority is accompanied by a conceptual shift. Instead of focusing on law, scholars now study international relations as pure power dynamics. This is a strange perspective coming from nations that for generations have done nothing but translate their own economic and military supremacy into legal terms." End of quote. So for Francine de Michel, international law itself was not in crisis. Rather, it was the imperialist legal order that was in crisis. The crisis was a reaction to the emergence of new international actors, specifically the post-colonial states, that were now asserting their own legal interpretation and challenging the domination of Western powers. She argued that as these newly independent states reshaped the international legal landscape, former colonial powers responded with a counteroffensive, attempting to discredit international law itself, saying that it is in crisis. She wrote in French, and I translate here in English, "This explains certain positions taken by the United States, for example, the threat to suspend its UN contributions. These are not isolated reactions, but part of a coherent strategy aimed at dismantling the new legal order, international legal order, as it emerges along with all its democratic potential." End of quote. So in her view, the so-called crisis of international law was not an inherent problem of law itself, but rather a discourse which was illustrative of a power struggle over who controlled its norms and institutions. My fourth and last author is Monique Chemillé-Gendreau, professor at the University of Paris 8 Diderot, who published in 1998 an article titled L'action humanitaire, une réponse inefficace à la crise du droit international. Humanitarian action, an ineffective response to the crisis of international law, in the journal L'Homme et la Société. The crisis she identified lays in a contradiction within international law itself, namely between, on the one hand, the prohibition of violence, particularly through the prohibition of the use of force in the UN Charter after World War II, and on the other hand, the perpetual management of violence through humanitarian law. According to her, humanitarian law does not actually eliminate violence, but merely regulate its excesses. She criticized this unduly limited approach, stating that, and I translate her words, "One does not cleanse war of its worst manifestation. One either attacks its root causes or resign oneself to the barbarity it represents." End of quote. Chemillé-Gendreau extended this critique to humanitarian action in general, which she viewed as an attempt of states and of non-government organizations to provide aid to populations suffering from military conflict and other structural forms of violence, economic, social, cultural. But she argued that while humanitarian action had expanded in recent decades, it failed to address the fundamental political, economic, and social mechanisms that generate these forms of violence. And even when international regulations existed, they were often poorly enforced. The collective security system remained inadequately implemented. Weapons production was insufficiently regulated. The raw materials market lacked rule to protect the interest of economically vulnerable states. In her conclusion, she wrote that, and I quote her, or I translate her words, "The solutions to the current global crisis are not exclusively legal. It would be highly presumptuous for legal scholars to claim they hold the key to our current impasse. However, No solution will emerge without the support of law. What is needed is a Copernican revolution in legal foundations, one that recognizes that past crises and world wars have led to the absurdities now concealed under the label of humanitarianism. End of quote. Certainly, the discourse here is more realist, and one does not find in Monique Chemillé-Gendreau's argument the idea that the history of international law is a history of progress in which international law is constantly, through its crises, developing and evolving for the better. However, the criticisms she directs to international law are precise and suggest possible pathway towards a more democratic, a more egalitarian functioning of international law that she certainly hopes for. In sum, the crises of international law, identified by international legal scholars, are diverse, triggered by major upheavals, and reveal in their view certain problems within international law that might be permanent and affecting the fundamental structures of international law. Problems that these scholars nevertheless analyze and for which they have solutions. Despite their concerns and despite their doubts, international law remains generally perceived as a relevant tool that must evolve in the best direction. So is this different in the age of permacrisis? Is permacrisis affecting our belief in the ability of international law to remain a relevant system of reference? Or is permacrisis shrinking our imagination, our desire, our will to study it and to suggest adequate reforms of international law? These are the questions I will now turn to in my second part of the speech, and it will be much briefer. When reading or listening to those who use the term permacrisis, particularly in the United Kingdom, where Brexit in 2017 marked the beginning of a series of crises, one finds three recurring characteristics, and let me recall and exemplify them a little more than I have done so far. First, the commentators using the term permacrisis affirm that our world is now subjected to multiple crises, each feeding into and reinforcing the others: financial crisis, climate crisis, health crisis, migration, wars, technological threats. All these crises collectively plunge societies into an unprecedented state of instability and insecurity, they say, the intensity of which generates a sense of anxiety about the future, where the only certainty seems to be the emergence of a new catastrophe soon. So in such a context, there is no perspective of escaping the permacrisis, no perspective of going back to normalcy. The second characteristic of this discourse on permacrisis is that in face of this permacrisis, institutions are said to be failing to function effectively. The United Nations are not meeting expectations, having missed all opportunities to renew the legal framework inherited from 1945, which now more than ever appear ill-suited to many actors, both from the North and the Global South. The UN Security Council remains regularly deadlocked. The G20 struggles to establish itself as a decisive platform for global governance. Geopolitical tensions between the United States and China prevent the adoption of a coherent, integrated approach to economic and financial challenges, paralyzing institutions such as the World Trade Organization. So in sum, multilateralism is threatened. And third, the third characteristic of this discourse on permacrisis is that the decision makers, the thinkers, are left trying to mitigate risks created by permacrisis, but are deprived of the possibility to imagine what would be a post-crisis world, lacking the time, the energy, the perspective to develop a long-term vision to rethink society beyond crisis management. Concentrating on this last aspect, one may ask to what extent this analysis is shared by international lawyers having engaged on the subject of crisis or crisis of international law or crisis of multilateralism in the last 5 years. Well, in general, and for now, I would say that international legal scholars do not seem to have abandoned the idea that international law is relevant during times of crisis and that its functioning can improve as a result of this crisis. A particularly illustrative example of this belief is found in the argument put forward by Yves Daudet in an article entitled "Never Let a Good Crisis Go to Waste. Can International Law Seize the Advantage?" And in this article, Yves Daudet suggests that in the face of terrorism, of cyber threats, of migration, health crisis, climate crisis, the international legal order must evolve. And I would like to quote him in order to illustrate his position. He says, and I quote him, "To determine whether international law can benefit from crisis, one must first ask what political projects have been decided in the face of crisis and what lessons can be drawn from them. And then one must ask which projects enrich international law so that in a preventive approach they can be applied in the future. By their scale and universality, crises are an opportunity not to be missed to accomplish this process of a real restatement of international law." End of quote. More specifically, in his view, state sovereignty must be adapted to the need of today's world, and the multilateral system must be strengthened and prioritized. Let me quote him again. "The positive thing about crises is that they are revealing of what normal time prevents us from seeing. They are an experiment in exactly the same way that during periods of confinement, the inhabitants of Beijing and major Chinese cities were able to experience what clean air and the absence of pollution was like, or the Venetians finding the blue of the lagoon while ducks were walking in the streets of Paris. These images have a strong impact on public opinion and can help in the adoption of better and more effective international standards because they raise public awareness." End of quote. So to Yves Daudet, crisis should prompt an in-depth reflection. He's even using the word of a philosophical approach like that invoked by the title of a painting that he refers to, a painting by Paul Gauguin, entitled "Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going To?" And Yves Daudet concludes that while crises are painful, they ultimately reveal our needs and aspirations for change. They help us to design a future based on rules of international law that are specifically adapted to attend to our future needs in a changing world. Well, his belief might not be found in such strong and even poetic terms in other articles or books published at approximately the same period, but this belief is still present in contributions by international lawyers and especially in works devoted to the crisis of multilateralism. So, in the book entitled "The Crisis of the Multilateral Legal Order, Causes, Dynamics and Implications," that was edited by Lukasz Gruzinski, Marcin Menkes, Weronika Bilkova, and Paolo Davide Farah in 2022. Well, in that book, many contributors were convinced that multilateralism was in crisis for various reasons, but they generally shared the need to overcome these crises, and they suggested ways to do so. In the book entitled Les Nations désunies, la crise du multilatéralisme dans les relations internationales, edited by Julian Fernandez and Jean-Vincent Olindre in 2022, many contributors were also convinced that multilateralism was experiencing a crisis, or was at least under radical transformation. But this does not lead them to consider multilateralism as irrelevant or unable. Rather, they were considering multilateralism as irreducible, as something that cannot be avoided, but just needs adaptation. And even in a more critical book, a book on the crisis narratives in international law, edited by Makan Bengue and Jean d'Apremont in 2022, you find potentialities for international law to be explored. Certainly, the book underlines the way in which international law is also responsible for creating the conditions of crisis, for shaping those crises. But there is room in this book for suggestions to imagine new ways for international law that could not only strengthen its resistance against crisis, but can also enrich and expand international law more generally. This is not to say that permacrisis does not have or will not have any influence on what international lawyers have to say in such context, but it remains striking to me how our belief in international law's progress seems unbreakable and certainly resistant to permacrisis. Maybe this is not so surprising, and I will come here to my concluding remarks. Because the idea of progress of international law is inherent to our discipline. It is so inextricably linked to international law, to our understanding of international law, that it has become a constitutive part of our discipline that might be as strong as the idea that international law is really law. The idea of progress has been at the center of how the history of international law has been told for a very long time and continues to be told to a certain extent. It has infused the practice of international law. International lawyers have been consulted to draft new treaties, to define new concepts, taking initiatives based on the idea that something in international law was missing and that we could care about making international law more complete, more consistent, more strong, that institution could be created, that new ideas had to be formalized, had to be codified. Maybe the idea of progress in international law will continue to stand in the age of permacrisis, and maybe it will not only continue to stand firmly in the age of permacrisis, but it might even grow stronger because it offers a horizon that is particularly appealing in the context of catastrophic events that we are witnessing with desolation, not to say despair. And maybe international lawyers will engage in thinking about international law in the age of permacrisis in renewed terms. Maybe the terms used will not be similar to the past, or maybe these terms will be less ambitious than in the past, because one might imagine that just keeping certain norms and structures as they are can contribute to defend the progressive values that they were set up to uphold in the first place. Or maybe these terms might be more ambitious, more radical, as the need for fundamental change would be made more urgent in the age of permacrisis. I understand that not everyone will be tempted to rally this path that might be considered an utopian path, but even if you are not, you might find some comfort in the idea that so far this voice that we can transform international law to make it better has not been rendered inaudible, because this might be a sign that not only that voice but also other voices are not yet excluded. This conversation might be able to go on in the age of permacrisis, maybe in different terms, but still a conversation, a collective conversation, a lively conversation, followed by subsequent action, which remain, to me, the safest journey through moments of sideration and disposition. I thank you very much for your attention.